while all around them, the liberals and the pro-communist leftists were calling for intervention in the European war. These conservative realists of yesteryear resisted the urge to jump on the war bandwagon. As Hitler's armies overran Czechoslovakia, Poland, France, Belgium, Holland, and then turned on the Soviets, their former allies, the America Firsters kept their cool and analyzed the crisis in terms of what would serve our distinctly American interests, rather than emotional attachments to the embattled British or any nonsensical idea that we would have to fight for Germans over there or else battle the Wehrmacht in the streets of Des Moines. In our own time, the analog to Pearl Harbor is, of course, the 9/11 attacks. And it's sad to say that all too many so-called libertarians, not to mention conservatives, succumbed to the hysteria. In a speech given to a special Cato Institute donors conference held on September 20th of that fateful year, Cato bigwig Tom G. Palmer attacked what he called the Blame America response to the attacks. That, he claimed, was coming from the American left and from some sectors of the right. Now, he spent most of his time during his 11-minute talk going after straw men, such as an editorial by Robert Kaiser in the Washington Post, which, in typical woolly-headed liberal fashion, tried to link the attacks to our failure to sign the Kyoto Accord. Whatever. But then Palmer somehow linked this to former libertarian John Gray's indictment of the free market, although the connection between Gray's economic views and 9/11 is very vague, if not non-existent. Senior Palmer then turned his sights on the attacks themselves, and here is where he lost his head and succumbed to hysteria. He described the attacks as, quote, an attack upon civilization itself, unquote. To hear him tell it at the time, none of this had anything to do with American foreign policy. It was all about our character as a people. The World Trade Center was, to his mind, quote, the perfect target for our enemies, end quote, and that they are or were symbols of commerce and prosperity, supposedly the objects of Osama bin Laden's unrelenting hatred and the real reason for the attacks. Now, oddly, there is no reference in his peroration to the Pentagon, which, as we all know, was also hit that day. And that was truly the crowning shock of that dramatic day, that the epicenter of American militarism and our foreign policy of global intervention proved to be so vulnerable. The sight of Pentagon employees running in panic for safety was surely one of the most memorable images of 9/11, one that the citizens of Washington, D.C. would not soon forget. And yet Palmer doesn't mention this at all, perhaps because it undermines his "they hate us because we're so rich and fabulous" thesis. The very myth, by the way, pushed by President Bush and now Rudolph Giuliani against all evidence to the contrary. As Ron Paul has pointed out to Mr. Giuliani, our wealth, our freedom, or now the remnants of our freedom, had nothing to do with the terrorist attacks carried out by al-Qaeda. It was blowback from the Middle East that was a direct consequence of our interventionist foreign policy. Palmer might say, or rather he might have said at the time, that this was just another leftist variation of the Blame America analysis of 9/11. But it is based firmly on the old conservative idea that one has to take responsibility for one's actions, and that actions, along with the ideas on which they're based, have consequences. Palmer and some others at Cato, including Brink Lindsay, their trade analyst, took this critique of the so-called Blame America left and used it as a bludgeon against the anti-war movement. While Palmer never openly endorsed the invasion of Iraq, spent most of the time attacking antiwar.com, Lindsay did, based on the utterly wrong idea that the 9/11 attacks were, quote, an attack upon civilization itself. A number of alleged libertarians took up the cause of Bush's war to transform the Middle East as the only way to, quote, drain the swamp, as they put it, of Islamic radicalism and eliminate the security threat to America once and for all. Ron Bailey, the science correspondent for Reason magazine, even undertook to construct a theory of libertarian Trotskyism, the idea that libertarianism in one country could not long survive, and that in order to secure the blessings of liberty for ourselves and our progeny, it was necessary to launch a worldwide effort to export the American system at gunpoint. This in a libertarian magazine, a disgrace. In the broader world of ideological opinion, longtime liberals caved in and cowered in fear as the war party strode triumphantly over the political landscape, meekly endorsing the invasion of Afghanistan as just retribution for the attacks. Their congressional wing gave the president a blank check, which he naturally cashed immediately, and which we are still paying for today, in spite of a liberal's belated attempts to rein him in. In the run-up to the invasion of Iraq, both parties jumped on the pro-war bandwagon, and any attempts to question the rationale for war were denounced as unpatriotic, at best, pro-terrorist at worst, and certainly an example of the so-called blame America attitude condemned by Tom Palmer in his talk to the Cato moneybags. After all, was this not a war on behalf of our civilization against evil men who hate us, not for anything our government has done, but simply because we exist? This hysteria, in retrospect, has certain darkly comic aspects, especially when we look at the pronouncements of certain high-profile intellectuals and bloggers who signed on to Bush's war. Indeed, who egged the war party on to unprecedented heights of folly and hubris, and who today are now recanting and denouncing the very president they once valorized as a heroic figure. Andrew Sullivan epitomized the hysterics of the war party when he suggested that the anthrax attacks sent to various news outlets and the offices of 2 senators were certainly the work of Saddam Hussein, and that this justified the dropping of a couple of nukes on Iraq. He has never retracted that statement. Yet today he masquerades as an anti-war blogger. Give us a break, Andy. Gee, it's a good thing he wasn't in any position to implement his proposal of nuclear holocaust as retribution for an attack that had nothing to do with either Saddam Hussein or the hapless Iraqi people. Otherwise, Iraq would today be a molten puddle of glass. But this is a perfect example of a temper of those times, of the witless hysteria that permeated the intellectual atmosphere, in which people were allowed to get away with such over-the-top exclamations of outrage and emotionalism, and which encouraged the war party to launch what General William E. Odom has rightly called the biggest strategic disaster in American military history, which is the invasion and occupation of Iraq by American forces. The intellectuals lost their heads, and that there were some ostensible libertarians among them should come as no great surprise. The modern libertarian movement has always been afflicted by a certain pro-war element. It was true during the Cold War era and is even more true today, when the hysteria level has reached fever pitch and the careers and incomes of so many policy wonks, particularly here in the imperial city, are dependent on going with the flow and remaining respectable even at the cost of their intellectual integrity. The reasons for their capitulation to war hysteria are not entirely mercenary, however, or due only to a lack of intellectual integrity. A lot of it was and is based on real fear, on the fear that, as Palmer put it, while the ruins of the World Trade Center were still smoking, we must, quote, resolve not to allow that to be the fate of our civilization itself, unquote.